Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this next iteration of our AVERT webinar series. Um, for this April's webinar, we're pleased to host Dr. Keiran Hardy, who's an associate professor at Griffith University. My name is Lydia Khalil. I'm the co-convener of the AVERT Research Network, and I'm pleased to be convening this webinar here with Keiran. And Keiran's webinar is titled How Not to Argue with a Sovereign Citizen, where he'll give us an overview of sovereign citizens based on a current research project that he's working on with colleagues out of the University of Queensland and others. Before we start, just as is customary, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're all meeting. We're all coming from various places in Australia and around the world, but I'd like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people here in Melbourne, in Victoria. Before I introduce Dr. Hardy a bit further, just to note to say that this webinar will be recorded and be made available later on. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions and to engage after Dr. Hardy's presentation. We ask that you please put your questions within the Q&A function, and we will be able to moderate those and then present those questions to Keiran for later. Now, to get us started, let me formally introduce Dr. Hardy. Dr. Keiran Hardy, as I said, is an associate professor at Griffith University, where he is focused considerably on laws, counterterrorism laws, and legal standings. And this current research project is based as part of a broader ARC-funded project on conspiracy extremism in Australia, where it's based out of Griffith University and the University of Queensland. Keiran, off to you. Let's get us started.
Thanks very much, Lydia. Let me just share my slides and then we'll get going. Okay. So I think that should all be showing and will be showing okay. So thank you very much for coming along. I'll start with just to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm coming to you from, which is the Kombumerri peoples of the Yugambeh language group. So the lands we call the Gold Coast, and pay respect to elders past and present and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present here today. And so, as Lydia mentioned, my background was in law and counterterrorism law in particular. And so I'm assuming some level of sort of exposure to sovereign citizen incidents amongst this group, particularly, during the COVID period and since. But this range of images, I suppose, is just designed also to show that, and I'll give some more examples too, of where sovereign citizen ideology there's been a much longer trend behind it. I mean, it goes back to anti-tax movements in the United States. We've had all sorts of quirky efforts to establish people's own micronations and be rulers of their own countries and so on. So I won't go into all those examples. I'll focus more on law enforcement and this sort of RBT or traffic stop situation. But I just wanted to recognize that sort of background and context as well. I also want to thank the Queensland Police Service, the Security and Counterterrorism Command, particularly Michael Mammerell, Michelle Stenning and Heath Hutchings. They've been, as I'll get to in terms of the video study that we've been doing, they've been generous enough to allow us to study a database of body-worn camera footage, which I will speak to my general findings on at the moment. And then I would also like to thank our ARC Discovery Project team. So this is a discovery project based at Griffith Criminology Institute and the University of Queensland with Professor Christina Murphy, Professor Adrian Cherney, Sabrina Sass is our postdoctoral research fellow, and Emma Shakespeare is our PhD student. And Emma in particular is working on this project on the body-worn camera footage, and I'll come back to more of an explanation as to what that involves in particular. But just wanted to give a special shout out to Emma as well for a lot of these discussions that have fed into this presentation. And then also Professor Peter Martin at Griffith University, who was former Corrections Commissioner in Queensland, and the Leadership in Counterterrorism Alumni Association, which is a group of senior law enforcement and intelligence officials across the Five Eyes nations who have invited us to present a couple of times on this and other topics around conspiracy extremism relating to our grant. So I just wanted to thank those people before jumping in as well. Okay, so in addition to the sort of, like I said, that context of we've seen an emerging trend, or we saw an emerging trend in COVID of an increase towards sovereign citizen ideology. And so generally speaking, I'll get to the detail, but generally speaking, these are people who believe that they are not subject to the laws of the nation. And so in Australia, that means one thing, and in other countries, it means another. So I don't want to I can't generalize globally from what we're looking at here in terms of largely traffic stops, RBTs, house visits in Queensland, and the sorts of things I'll even say about the ideology and risk factors and so on. That won't necessarily be the same wherever else we look. I mean, those of you who might have seen Queen Dudulo in Canada, who believes she's the Queen of Canada. There was a plot in Germany that was sort of harkening back to the World War II era, and all sorts of other overlaps too with sort of pro-men's movements and misogynistic movements, all sorts of things. So, and we know that in some cases, sovereign citizen ideology can feed into terrorism. I mean, there's a sort of paper terrorism idea that sovereign citizens are very disruptive to agencies, but also terrorism proper as well. So when we talk about, say, RBTs and some of the more kind of bizarre or eccentric aspects of the movement, I don't mean to also downplay the significance or possibility for greater violence. And perhaps in the question time, that would be a really interesting topic for some more discussion as well around what is the capacity for anyone with sovereign citizen ideology to become violent. I want to introduce, even though it sounds a little bit technical, but I do believe that the best way to understand what is going on with sovereign citizen ideology, and so many of you be familiar with those sorts of images of the traffic stops, where you get a sovereign citizen arguing with a police officer over things like the common law and I'm not subject to your jurisdiction, I don't stand under your jurisdiction, all this kind of stuff. And I've got a range of quotes coming up. But oftentimes it's thought of as a sort of conspiracy theory, or people talk about it as a bit of a subset of right-wing extremism. But it has a much longer, this sort of ideology and the sorts of beliefs and arguments behind it have a much longer history and trajectory in terms of what's called the pseudo-law movement. And people don't often, well, it's probably a more academic version of it, but I don't see this understanding so much in the media, probably because it's more technical, but it does help a lot to understand what's going on. So pseudo-law is a collection of legal sounding but false rules that purport to be law. And so there's no basis for this in the law, and we'll come back to some of the specific arguments. But it is associated with a conspiratorial narrative, so it feeds into these ideas of conspiracy extremism. But pseudo-law is basically the idea of making legal arguments that are inaccurate, false, based on misinformation. So I suppose in a similar way to how you might think of health advice with anti-vaccine movements and things. It's a bit of a sort of anti-law movement or a misunderstood law movement. And so Dr. Donald Nedlitsky is a Canadian lawyer and academic who's written a lot about pseudo-law and the history of it. And what he finds is that it's remarkably consistent worldwide. So while there is a lot of variation in sovereign citizen movements worldwide, the sorts of arguments that tend to get made in Western countries that are part of this sort of pseudo-law collection of arguments are actually quite consistent. And I just wanted to give a bit of a shout out as well, or recommendation if anyone is interested in reading more about pseudo-law in Australia in particular, and New Zealand as well. So Professor George Williams, who was my PhD supervisor, and now the VC at WSU, has written with Harry Hobbs at UNSW, Stephen Young at Otago, and Joe McIntyre at UniSA. A couple of books, the one on the left, Pseudo-Law and Sovereign Citizens, is just very recently released. And then George and Harry have written a book a couple of years ago now called How to Rule Your Own Country, which I suppose is less so an instruction manual and more so, an insight into the sorts of the micronations that have existed all around the world and attempts for one individual to say, I am the ruler of my own country. And especially with George as a constitutional law expert, talking about kind of the intricacies of sovereignty. and power relationships in a country, and what does it mean to kind of, can you set up your own country? What are sort of the elements of power and law behind that? So it's a really fascinating topic. Okay, so here are some of the things that if you've watched any of the YouTube videos or seen the news articles around sovereign citizen in Australia, these are the sorts of things. So this is just a collection of publicly available quotes, some of them, influenced by the QPS videos as well, around the sorts of things that they end up saying. So when a police officer stops someone who ends up arguing sovereign citizen ideology or pseudo law arguments with them, they might say things like, I'm under common law earth. I'm not under your jurisdiction. I do not understand. I don't stand under your authority. I do not wish to do business with you. So, now maybe there's more sort of familiarity around these arguments. But at the time, when it first started emerging, the idea that you'd pull over someone for speeding and they'd say, well, I do not wish to do business with you, sounded a little bit strange. And then your badge number is your indemnity clause. You commonly hear that police agencies have an ABN and all these sorts of things. So, I'm a flesh and blood person. I'm a living man. Do you think I'm a living man? And these arguments that just end up going nowhere and going round and round in circles. And I spent a lot of time trying to understand, going into the depths of sovereign citizen ideology and trying to understand it from a legal perspective. So with legal training, you can understand like sort of what they're getting at with certain concepts, but also, and then you can really just tie yourself in knots and go endlessly around. Well, that bit of what they're saying is sort of true, but this is inaccurate for these reasons, and you can really get tied up with it. I eventually came to the position that, no matter sort of what was being said as part of that argument, I think it's more important to sort of boil it down to what's going on under that. One core idea is what's referred to as the straw man duality. And so this is this idea that basically the idea that sums up a lot of what those arguments are saying is that when we are born, we are a living person. You cry, you breathe your first breath, and you enter the world. And at that point, you're sort of a pure, natural human being. And then what happens is increasingly you become ruled in your life by all sorts of government regulations, identification numbers. So there's quite specific arguments around, well, the fact that our name is written on our birth certificate in capital letters is sort of significant for the government controlling us. So all these sorts of legal documents. The reason why straw man and why the scarecrow is there is because this idea that this legal person is your straw man, but underneath that straw man that is controlled by the government, I am still a living natural person. So what sovereign citizens are trying to do is in all of those sorts of arguments, is to reassert their nature as a living natural being, not subject to the law. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect that I've called the contract fallacy is just a way of sort of understanding a lot of what those specific arguments around contract law and government agencies having an ABN and so on, because it will come out in different ways from all sorts of people. But this is basically how I would summarize what's going on a lot of the time. Firstly, to say, well, the Australian government is a corporation, or the police is a corporation, they have an ABN. Corporations are governed by contract law. Therefore, all Australian law operates under contract law, or every relationship with the police is governed by contract law. Then if we take that as a starting point and say, well, all Australian law operates under contract law, we know that contracts are only enforceable only if both parties agree and consent to the terms. Therefore, I am only subject to Australian law if I consent and agree to this law. And I need, as a living natural being, to consent to that law in order for me to be governed by your jurisdiction. And so I think that kind of approach basically sums up a lot of the stuff that will get sort of thrown out in argument. And so I think that's a useful way to understand it. And you can see also that there is a logic behind it. It's not completely irrational. Like you start with the idea that a government agency has an ABN because they enter into contracts and so on. And then you sort of flow on from there. And you can see from that diagram that it's not like too much of a leap to make that argument. And I'll come back to this idea of how there's these sorts of half-truths involved sometimes. Because I think a lot of the time sovereign citizen ideology gets dismissed as this very sort of bizarre, irrational thing akin to QAnon or something else. Like it's these completely sort of out there ideas. But this is the kind of language that they use: trespass, corporations, common law, sovereignty, consent, standing, freedoms, contracts, all sorts of things. These are all things you'll learn about in a law degree. And we have, you can read textbooks and textbooks on this kind of stuff. So the language that they use is not like all these words mean something legally speaking. And So it becomes quite difficult for people in the general population to know exactly what, without a detailed understanding of constitutional law, it gets very complicated. So I'll come back to some of those ideas. Here's just an example I prefer to show you. So one of that idea around the straw man as a sort of legal personality and a natural or living being under that. It sounds bizarre when you start getting into flesh and blood and people signing things with with their own blood and on contracts and all the kinds of stuff that goes on with sovereign citizens. But I mean, legal personhood, like the capacity to enter into legal arrangements. So like I am a legal person that can enter into a contract with someone else. The whole idea of a corporation, corpus coming from the Latin body, is individuals joining together into one body so that that grouping of individuals has a single legal personhood and can then enter contracts with other people. So those ideas, that is part of contract law and corporations law theory. And so I just pulled a recent article from the UNSW Law Journal that's about evolving concepts of legal personhood and how with current debates around climate change and so on, maybe our concepts of legal personhood need to be applied to non-human beings as well, so animals. Now, if you read that heading without the context that I gave you, and then saw some other examples, you might think, well, so you hear legal personhood from a sovereign citizen, everybody thinks it's, sort of this completely bizarre out there idea. But these are ideas that are debated in the law, and I think it's important to recognize that. Here's an example of a case that went to the Victorian Supreme Court recently, to give you another idea of how these sorts of arguments can play out. Because you might be thinking, well, if these arguments are completely ridiculous, how does anyone even get before a court and make them? So if somebody ends up contesting a traffic charge, like a speeding charge or whatever else it might be, parking fine, they have legal standing in that matter. They can go before a court, they can make their own arguments, they can represent themselves. And then so sometimes these things can progress higher and higher. They're not just dismissed immediately. It can take some work to sort of to argue back against it. So here's a case just a couple of years ago that went to the Victorian Supreme Court. And in the end, yeah, it's a waste of time, but making the argument. But actually, like if you get into the detail of it, you can sort of see what they're getting at insofar as, and I don't want to start sounding like these arguments, I'm not in any way suggesting these arguments are strong legally. But to give you an insight, so this was a case where somebody was speeding in a Range Rover. And what they did was they said, I don't deny that I was speeding, that I was the one in the vehicle and so on. But how they ended up arguing this all the way to the Victorian Supreme Court was to say that the Range Rover was not a vehicle, according to an understanding of the law, and these sorts of arguments that flowed on from that. And you might go, well, that's ridiculous. A Range Rover is of course a vehicle. And that ends up being the final result. But how they managed to succeed a little bit and get a little bit further was because the definition of a driver in the legislation says a driver of a vehicle includes a two-up driver and L-plated driver. So like shift driving, like for truck driving, for logistics, and L-platers. Now, on a common sense understanding, you say, well, okay, driver means its ordinary meaning, but it also includes this thing. And what the legislation is doing is clarifying that wherever you see driver in the legislation, it will include these quite specific categories of drivers so that an L-plater can't go into court and say, well, you can't charge me because I'm not a driver. So the legislation accounts for a certain number of sort of particular situations, but it doesn't bother defining driver in itself. There isn't a definition of that. So they go in there and they say, well, I'm not one of those two categories of driver, and that's what the definition says. And then the court has to go through quite complex statutory interpretation methods to explain that, well, we start with the ordinary meaning of the word and then we get into specific cases. And in fact, like one of the first things you'll learn in law school, in a legal theory class from H.L.A. Hart, one of sort of the founding fathers of modern legal theory, I suppose, if you like, from Oxford University, is the idea. He gives the example of precisely of a vehicle in the law as sort of a philosophical or legal question, which is to say, what does a vehicle mean? So the example he gives as a rule is to say, well, vehicles cannot enter into a park. Then you go, okay, well, what is a vehicle? You start listing cars, you list utes, vans, whatever. But does a vehicle include, what about a remote control car controlled by a kid? And Hart discusses that example. And he says, well, at that point, we start with the definition, but then we have to get into questions of fairness and interpretation and everything else. So yes, while the end result is that there's no real legs to it as an argument, you can see why this sort of information catches on in the rest of the population. Okay, so because of this, we're going to play a game that I've called law or pseudo law. And so what I want you to do, there's probably not much point sort of everyone writing in the chat when the two answers are only law or pseudo law. And it's probably the worst TV game show ever. But okay, so what I want to do is show you some examples, and I'll give you 5 seconds or something to pick whether you think it is law or pseudo law, to show you that it's not really that easy to pick sometimes whether it's that ridiculous or not. So the first example, natural and customary law allows for the establishment of popular courts of justice when the existing legal and governmental authorities are subverting law and justice. Common law arose historically to uphold the liberties of the people against tyrants, whether religious or secular, etc., has universal jurisdiction when convened as a jury court. So if you just saw that on face value, would you think that is actually from the law, or do you think it's a sovereign citizen legal act? And so the answer to this one is, this is from a Facebook page on the Common Law Court Australia headquarters. And they have, so you can see their sort of appropriation of Indigenous symbols, and they have established their own tribunal to sort of hear cases on certain matters. Here's another one, the international law of the sea. So we often hear maritime law in sovereign citizen arguments, sovereignty and sovereign rights of nations over areas of the sea, freedoms of ships to traverse the seas. So you often hear drivers saying around that they're traveling, or they're under maritime law and they're not under the roads and traffic and safety acts around the states. First attempt by nations to codify the law of the sea under the auspices of the United Nations in 1958. So law or pseudo law. This is from a legal briefing by the Australian government solicitor called Ruling the Waves, regulating Australia's offshore waters, because there is a whole area of law that relates to maritime law, international law, trade law, and so on. What about this one? In future, it shall be lawful for any man to leave and return to our kingdom unharmed and without fear by land or water, reserving his allegiance to us except in time of war for some short period for the common benefit of the realm. People that have been imprisoned or outlawed in accordance with the law of this land, people from a country that is at war with us, and merchants who shall be dealt with as stated above are exempted from this provision. Law or pseudo law. This is actually from the real Magna Carta, as recorded in the Australian and UK parliamentary libraries. So that's clause 41, and that is part of our legal history. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a mechanism for Indigenous sovereignty. It's a guide track for Indigenous peoples to establish sovereignty, engage in economic innovations. We're talking self-determination principles. The indigenation, if you've heard of the indigenation, you may well know that this is a group of First Nations peoples using sovereign citizen type ideas in the north of Queensland. But otherwise, the language is very professional on the website. The language of nations doesn't even necessarily stand out that much compared to Canada and the United States, where the word nation is used quite a lot, more commonly than in Australia. Microstates gives it away a little bit, but there's not a lot in there to identify. Here's one. I've clearly got too caught up in this game, but the triumph of the natural entity theory, talking about corporations, like I said before, like what is a corporation under the law? And this is talking about the shift from understanding corporations as a sort of a separate entity controlled by government towards a corporation, like I explained before, as a sort of grouping of individuals into one single legal personhood. And that's an article on theories of the corporation from the Duke Law Review in the United States. So you can see there at the bottom, emphasize the corporation's origin in the natural activities of private individuals. And finally, a bill for an act for a referendum to amend Section 128 of the Constitution, etc., etc. Short title, Commencement, Parliament Acts. This looks a lot like any kind of bill and a bill for a referendum that might be put forward in Parliament, but this is from advanceaustralia.com.au, citizens-initiated referendums. And this guy, Mike Holt here, has a whole kind of podcast series that, if you've got too much time on your hands, is a great listen. There's music. You can go in and buy music from his website, songs about, Australian patriotism and so on. There are Zoom chats, with people overseas discussing the same kinds of issues, and a lot of legal advice, and you can purchase educational courses and everything else. But you can see from the language that, I don't know, they may well have, they've obviously copied it quite closely from other bills and so on. So it can be very difficult for people in the population to discern those things. So I want you to kind of hold that idea in mind around, okay, so you can start to understand how somebody without legal knowledge could very well get drawn into this. I think of it less like a conspiracy theory and more like Googling medical information online. If I thought that let's say I needed to renovate my bathroom, but I didn't think I needed licensed trades. So I Google how to do something, but I'm holding a trowel the wrong way. Like and then I think that I'm an expert in this area, all that kind of. So it's more like misinformation, people seeking out help when they needing it, but not having the sort of education to be able to understand what's going on. But the same kinds of concepts being used and everything. So that's sort of a little bit of that's more the sort of background ideology, maybe just a way to understand what's going on. And then what I want to move into now is to talk a bit more about the study that we're doing with QPS. So I just want to be clear that these are the two videos that I'm going to show are not QPS videos. I'm not showing any footage from the Queensland Police Service. I've just picked a couple of examples from YouTube that were published on media websites that will show the kind of thing that we're looking for. So this is publicly available footage, and some of you may well have seen some of these examples. But what we're really looking at in terms of, and so QPS, like I said, has been generous enough to give us access to a database of 280 of these videos, these sorts of videos. And what we're looking for essentially is around the concept of procedural justice policing and whether procedural justice concepts around giving people voice, treating them with respect, and trust in the police more generally speaking as well, is important to de-escalating interactions with sovereign citizens to prevent some of the kinds of escalating interactions that you'll see here. So I'll play this one first.
Just stop talking for a second. Listen to what I'm asking you. What's your full name?
I do not consent.
You're going to be arrested shortly for failing to provide the details.
Under what law? Can I have a say?
No, I've asked you to explain.
Why can I
I've asked you.
talk?
Listen. You are unlicensed at the moment.
At the moment, excuse me.
You're obstructing me.
Excuse me.
All right.
Excuse me.
Ma'am, you're under arrest. Turn the car off. Turn the car off now. Don't put that on me. I'll bust your window. Put the window down.
So this is
Put
violence.
the window down.
Is this violence?
Put your window
Is this
down.
violence?
You're under arrest.
Under what law?
You're unlicensed.
I will come out if you calm down.
Open the door now.
I will open the door if you calm down. If you calm down, I'll open. Can you feel me? Look.
Seatbelt off. Under arrest. Under the seatbelt. Open the car. Put the handbrake on. Oh my goodness.
Okay, so what you see there is an interaction that escalated from probably a speeding or a stop or an RBT. And so this has been posted online by the person themselves and media's gotten a hold of it. And then you can see it escalate from what was otherwise, a pretty routine traffic stop to, an arrest and a more forceful arrest. And in some cases, you may well have seen the video of police in another one actually breaking the window and getting the person out of the car. So from sort of nothing much as an interaction that should just be routine, escalating because of this ideology and these arguments around I do not consent, I'm not under your jurisdiction. And then you can see the examples there of, when I come back to procedural justice ideas, can I have a say? No, you can't. And how those sorts of interactions escalate it. Now I'll show you a contrasting example with a different officer.
You were receiving infringement notice in the mail for failing to wear a seatbelt, okay?
Do your best.
Okay. Do you...
I don't consent to any of this.
Yep. What are your details, if that's right? Just your name and date of birth.
We'll have to get that to you for.
Yep,
so am I under obligation to give you that license?
So you provided to give me
By
your
law?
name and address.
By law?
Name and address, yes.
Can you cite that law for me, please?
Yep, so it's the Summary Offences Act, which is 458.
Act, it's not law.
Yep.
So you agree on the man?
I don't know. I'm not going to assume your gender, sir.
I think you can tell. A man, as in mankind.
I can't assume your gender. I can't assume your gender. I apologise.
You're right.
Yeah, I can't do that.
Yeah, I'm an 80-year-old lady. Do you agree on the
I don't know
man?
what you identify
A
as.
living man. I'm alive. Am
I
I alive?
agree that you're alive, yes.
I'm alive.
Yeah,
Okay.
I fully agree that you're alive.
Okay.
Yeah.
So living man, as
You're
in
present- You're
mankind.
present in body and mind.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
you
I fully
haven't
agree.
stipulated to me that law where I have to give you my license. Show
Yeah,
you my
so it's the
license.
Summary Offences Act. Your mobile phone is there. You're more than welcome to look up the Summary Offences Act. Go for it.
Act as well.
Okay, so what you see there in those two videos is two contrasting examples of how those situations can go. And look, speaking causally, like it's quite hard to say, well, okay, had the police in the second video taken the approach in the first video, would that have turned out differently? Yeah, there are lots of variables, people's personalities and all sorts of things. But what we're hoping is that with 280 of these videos, and Emma has just finalized a very detailed instrument for studying these videos systematically. So not just sort of watching them, and I'll show you some quotes from them, written quotes from them, a qualitative study, but looking at them more quantitatively and systematically as well, and measuring all sorts of things with its items relating to procedural justice theory, also techniques of neutralization from criminology, which are things like, say people might say something like, well, speeding's a victimless crime, nobody's harmed by what I'm doing, and the sorts of justifications that sovereign citizens give that feed into other theories in criminology as well to help understand from that lens. But the idea of procedural justice policing being largely that that police officers, when they treat people with respect, when they treat people in an unbiased or neutral way, when they give people an opportunity to have their voice and their side of the story heard, and then when there's a relationship of trust too, and people viewing police as a legitimate institution, and governments as well on the government level. So we're looking at these concepts, relating them to conspiracy mentality and conspiracy thinking more generally, but then especially in the context of, for this part of the project, how procedural justice can impact on those sorts of interactions. So with the database of videos, procedural justice theory, looking at it through some other criminological lenses too, and hoping to draw some conclusions around the specific types of, or the specific elements of procedural justice that might be most important. But even on an initial watching of these videos, so like I said, we're moving towards, and hopefully at some point we'll be able to share with you more specific findings around, the sort of the quantification or systematic analysis of these videos. It's very clear from watching through the videos that what we are seeing is, or like sort of forgetting the ideology, it becomes very apparent very quickly that in these sovereign citizen interactions, police are dealing with people with a wide range of intersecting disadvantage. So in addition, you can start with things like unlicensed, unregistered vehicles, drink driving, evidence of substance abuse, domestic violence cases where there's a call out and somebody might be saying something about sovereign citizen ideology, but this is clearly a domestic violence situation. It can be men, being arrested for sending harassing messages, and in an arrest for a domestic violence offense, they are using the sovereign citizen ideology to try and get out of that. Mental health and mental distress becomes very obvious in some cases, including delusional beliefs in a small number of cases, but for the most part, I'd say these are more sort of pseudo-law arguments by people not as a form of delusion. Disability, physical, mental, unemployment, and I'll show you some quotes as to why I think these things very soon. Homelessness, and previous interactions with police that have really coloured the current experiences and the current interaction. And so I've got, like, why does he have a fish there? The ideology is, I always think of the ideology as a red herring, and to think what's going on under the hood, that would come as no surprise to anybody probably listening in this group. But I think there's just so much focus on the ideology as this sort of bizarre ideas, crazy, delusional beliefs around not being subject to the law. And what we have as a starting point is an ideology that, is misguided and based on a whole bunch of misinformation. But you can see that overlap with the law, and it's very hard to distinguish as someone without legal training what is accurate from what is not. So take that as a starting point, combine that with some people online who will try to, either intentionally or unintentionally, put out this information to try to help people as well. They start selling products, they've got their own debts, they're trying to sell stuff. It's more like a scheme, like a scheme to scam or mislead more vulnerable people into getting drawn into this worldview. So whenever we see the ideology, I really just think of it as a red herring. In the same way how, we've probably over-focused on ideology with regard to ISIS, possibly due to right-wing extremism as well, like what are the underlying causes of this ideology rather than, just focusing on the ideology itself. So what's going on under the hood? All these things are bubbling up. They're so apparent but what they're saying that's coming out of their mouth is about, you need a proclamation from the king to pull me over for this car. And you think, what a bizarre idea. I need to argue back against that. But in order for this to be solved, it really needs to focus, much more on what's going on under the hood. So I'll run through a range of quotes and then finish up with what I think what our initial findings are suggesting will be really effective. But as I run through these quotes, you'll get a really quick idea of what's going on. So I'm not transcribing all that stuff you saw before, like I'm a flesh and blood person. We could do that. And I sort of started with that in mind to think more about the ideology. It became very apparent very quickly that this is much more important. So there's somebody, there are various sorts of things, people being stopped at train stations, RBTs and so on. I don't have any money. I'm unable to work because I'm sick. I've got bad medical conditions from police misuse. You abuse people and you stop them being able to work in this country. And so obviously I'm not speaking to the truth of any of these statements. I'm just saying that these statements were made. Now that's you personally. You personally stop people being able to work. So quite like personal anger towards an officer that they've never met before. That individual officer hasn't dealt with them before, but there is so much sort of vitriol towards the police as an institution and individual officers based on past experience. You're profiling me, so claims of profiling and corruption and so on. You've known me for 4 years. You've effed up my life for 4 years. I'm trying to live my life and go about my thing, but it's the police that keep impacting on me, making complaints to various institutions. This one was quite interesting. So this is a Victorian tourist in Queensland. Claims I'm going to report you and so on to the CCC. But I have a disability. You single people out. I've had this treatment before. You don't have authority to do this. And then the final comment, I'm pre-Fitzgerald, I found very interesting. So that's referring to the major anti-corruption inquiry in Queensland in the late 1980s. Now, are they a Victorian resident or a Queensland resident who moved? I don't know. But a long sort of trajectory of this idea of distrust in police, which plays directly to that procedural justice idea. You should be chasing criminals. I'm not a criminal. I'm not doing anything that harms anyone. I just see hassling. You're supposed to be public servants. So you're supposed to be helping people and you're not. A lot of anger around that. You guys, if there's an emergent reason, well, I've got no money. I need to support my family. So that's an emergent reason for me. So some of them are quite reflective on why they've developed these ideas as well. And then so in terms of what we think works, these are some of the examples of the videos where there's been really effective interactions. So this was, would you like to do an interview with us and tell us your side of the story? Well, what do you want to hear? Well, mate, there's two sides to every story. That kind of a rapport and discussion. What's really interesting is that, say, the person finally agrees and says, okay, let's talk about it. What the transcript doesn't show is that there was a big pause before that. And also before this part of the transcript, he was mouthing off all the same sort of stuff on the slide before. But then when the officer intervened with that kind of an approach, will you tell your side of the story? Come on, we'll listen to you. He just paused and went, hold on. Why are they agreeing with me? And then they had to move on to something more productive. So rather than it escalating, very much de-escalating. This is a really fantastic example of an RBT on the side of a sort of rural or regional road. Person being quite polite and cooperative in one sense, but also very defiant and saying the same sorts of sovereign citizen things and refusing to do an RBT. And this officer did a fantastic job of saying, what I'm trying to do is protect other users on the road. I cannot do this unless you do this and everyone else does it too. So the question is this, so do you wish to provide a specimen of breath for the purposes of being on your way as quickly as possible? It's a really effective technique for sort of redirecting it from some of that argument towards the common purpose. Okay, so how to argue with a sovereign citizen? That's very easy. It does not take much effort at all. But if you start citing legislation at them, I mean, that's not a sort of fatal error. You saw in the video before that the officer just still did quite a good job saying what the requirement of the law was, and in some cases giving a caution and so on will require that. But doing that as the main way to try to convince them to comply with whatever order it is not likely to be effective. Getting into an argument about driving versus traveling, they love that. It doesn't take much to get them going. And they really believe in that idea very strongly that traveling is not driving. Dismissing their belief in any way, saying, I'm not listening to this rubbish, that kind of treatment. So very against those ideas of procedural justice policing. Threatening arrest for non-compliance. Now, obviously, in some circumstances, the consequences of what they're doing will need to be explained to them. But again, all these as mechanisms throughout the interaction to try to get the person to comply, and just to that when that starts repeating, that is when these interactions escalate. So then how not to argue with a sovereign citizen? What are we seeing that looks really effective? Building rapport. So the police officers who just chat and go, right, where are you traveling to today? Oh, the Sunny Coast. Then the person is distracted from what they see as the main game of trying to defy the police officer with that ideology. It doesn't mean you have to agree with all the ideology. You can either just say, look, mate, I'm not interested, but without dismissing it completely as rubbish. or just say, look, we'll have to agree to disagree on that, but this is what I need to do. Acknowledge those common goals. Moving on. You want to get on with your day, I want to get on with my day. How can we kind of reach agreement? So in addition to procedural justice ideas, well, it's a form of negotiation or kind of dispute resolution tactics as well, which are common to the law as well. Explain law in everyday language. An interview gives the opportunity to tell your side of the story. Explain the purpose behind the power. We're doing this for public safety. And in that, humanizing officers and the job they're doing for the community. It was a fantastic example of an officer who was accused of being corrupt, and how can you issue parking tickets for your job and your life? And he said, look, mate, it's not the best part of the job and I don't really enjoy it, but I have been to really serious road crashes and I don't want anyone to see that or that to happen to any other kids or family members. And then the guy just kind of shut up and complied. So there are very effective techniques coming out of this. Giving voice, explaining that they'll have a chance to tell their story. And above all, keep them traveling. They really love the idea of traveling. Just use the word traveling rather than driving, and still do the legal requirements that you need to. But yeah, get them going on their way. And that seems to work very effectively too. So I'll stop there. Thank you for listening. And if you've got any questions, just reach out and email me. And I'm very interested to answer any questions or engage in any discussion too.
Thank you so much, Keiran, for that presentation. That was kind of a fascinating take and interesting to hear your approach and suggestions around procedural justice. Like we've mentioned to everyone when we started this presentation, please put any questions that you've got for Keiran in the Q&A function, and we'll moderate and get to those. We have one now, Keiran, and it's asking a question about the commercialization of sovereign citizen ideology. You alluded to it a little bit in your presentation, but the question asks if you've seen like the sale or the supply of pseudo-legal law letter document kits, and if you could talk a little bit about the kind of the influencers and personalities around that.
Yeah, it's a really important question. And yeah, so I mentioned for that website, you can go on and you can find like so if you go to commonlaw.earth and all these other sorts of websites, you can get linked to education programs. You can go spend $500 on learning about the Australian Constitution. And for people who want to learn something, maybe don't have that much money, and wouldn't go through a university degree, it looks like some of these websites, some of them stand out to me and probably a lot of people as being quite obviously sort of just the quality of them isn't quite there. But others are actually really deceptive and misleading. Like the quality is actually very good. You can go on Amazon and you can Google sovereign citizen number plates and find them from, different sorts of companies online, all sorts of things. So yeah, it absolutely happens. And I think it's a big risk. And I think in terms of law enforcement strategies as well, going after the people who are peddling this stuff as a type of either fraud, to get money out of people on false basis. I think the trick with fraud is if they're not necessarily being dishonest, if they genuinely believe it. But there can be other avenues, like if you give legal advice without the proper qualifications, there's legal consequences to that. So I think focusing on those people who are peddling this stuff is a much better strategy, and then helping the people who are making all those arguments in the car because they've gone onto Facebook and bought a story or something. Yeah.
Thanks, Keiran. We've got a few more coming in. So one of the questions asks about forensic risk factors and potential overlap. So the question is, do you tend to identify things such as attitudes of entitlement or other particular implicit theories that might contribute to handling these interactions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think our thinking at the moment is also around strain theory and just the idea that these sort of compounding disadvantages really draw people towards the ideologies. And so, I mean, in terms of like overlap with other sorts of risk factors we've seen in terrorism, I think there's certainly an overlap in terms of disadvantage education, but I mean, we know that it's also hard to draw any kind of patterns to this, so I'm cautious to sort of overstate that. But I do think that maybe in comparison to say the consensus around ISIS ideology that education levels wasn't necessarily a core factor. I do think that in the sovereign citizen case, a lack of education would be much more apparent because it is people seeking out legal materials without the knowledge or backing to be able to, and it takes a lot of training to be able, like when you see those examples side by side, to be able to pick that apart. So yeah, I think some overlap and probably a greater focus on lack of education for the sovereign citizen group.
So can I ask you a related question myself, and this kind of goes broader in terms of the potential for violence out of sovereign citizens, either in these interactions that you've been studying or more broadly. We've seen how sovereign citizens take up court resources, how they've kind of mucked up operations around local council functionings, and we have seen issues around threats. But in terms of your assessment about it leading to violence and violent extremism, what's your kind of general take on that with sovereign citizens?
Yeah, it's a really good question and something we could probably talk about for quite a long time, because it's, like I said at the beginning, I don't want to sort of, you can joke about the RBT traffic stops and you need a proclamation from the king and all this kind of stuff, but I don't mean to downplay, that potential. I think I see the relationship with terrorism being that sovereign citizen ideology could be part of the sort of, when we talk about salad bars and pick and mix kind of ideologies, that if we see an act of terrorism in Australia, it may well have an element of sovereign citizen ideology in there, but it's this sort of mixed, unclear, unstable, and they're just throwing some ideas out there. So rather than it being sort of a sovereign citizen proper, like kind of cohesive ideology, I think that we need to be aware of it as one part of that kind of mix. I think what's missing from sovereign citizen ideology in terms of terrorism and violent extremism is an enemy. So I think, I suppose, yes, the government and police officers may well be, but they're not using the language of being at war with police, or they'll be very angry that the police is a corrupt institution and this kind of stuff. But it's very different to sort of language we see with right-wing extremist groups around sort of impending conflict, like accelerationism. We're moving towards some kind of larger conflict. If anything, I think these people, like a lot of the materials you read, they're really trying to help everyday Australians by saying, like, look, I found out that you don't actually have to pay your mortgage either. Like, here's the information that will help you do that. So I think that idea of citizens or civilians as an enemy isn't present in the same way as elsewhere. To go back to like the Queen Dodula example, I think where you see the most serious examples of this, that's like a more core sovereign citizen ideology, is where somebody thinks they're a ruler, and that leads to death threats against members of parliament, or against academics who write about these areas. And I've seen that too, that somebody who writes about Queen Dodula will get a death threat in the mail that includes like a notice to appear and a summons and a subpoena and all this kind of stuff. So I think if it starts getting to that level in Australia, or a claim to territory, I'd be very worried about. Like if, and this maybe goes to David's question as well, I think there's a big difference in Australia in terms of the whole firearms situation, obviously. So I think in particular, I can't really speak to sovereign citizen militia movements in the US or anything like that. That's a very different kettle of fish. So, but if a group in Australia started, we see a lot of sort of camping trips and other sorts of things with other terrorist groups, preparing. If I saw that with any kind of a claim to territory, I'd be more worried. So I think there's different things going on. I think the majority of the sovereign citizen ideology in Australia is the sort of Aussie battler. How do you get out of your mortgage? I don't want to pay tax. Harking back to sort of the anti-tax movements of the 1970s in the US. And then, there is still the potential for this to play into a more serious act of terrorism, either a false, like a fake legal proceeding against, we've seen like arrest warrants for Dan Andrews after COVID and stuff like that. Somebody actually, went through with that. So a targeted act against a member of parliament, someone in a position of authority, or a claim to territory. And obviously, if we get into a situation where there's somebody more delusional beliefs involved, a combination of that mixed unclear ideology, then it could be any lone actor attack could involve an element of it. Really fascinating issue.
So maybe we can get to the specifics of David's question around firearms ownership. You alluded to the fact that the violent threat is a lot more serious out of the United States, where the sovereign citizen movement originally where it originated, and because of the access to firearms, it has the threat, particularly to law enforcement, is acute. Have you studied this in Australia? Have you taken a look at the intersection between firearms ownership here?
No, only indirectly, in the sense of, sort of firearms licensing and so on can be sort of, one, warning sign in some respects. But we haven't studied that directly. I think because the environments are so different, I don't want to draw too many conclusions from, and we just don't have the same number of examples in Australia, but it is a very fascinating question. So yeah, perhaps we could talk about that more as well, David.
Yeah. Well, also, and you know, thankfully, it's probably not that quite that issue or acute here in Australia because of more restrictions. So you mentioned kind of in your previous answers, kind of the intersection, especially during the COVID times, with sovereign citizen, at least language. We saw a definite uptick in awareness of sovereign citizen language during COVID. But then there's a question here, again, broadening that out, to what extent or how does sovereign citizen ideology prevail in terms of right-wing extremism and other forms of ideologically motivated extremism? So I guess the question is asking, you know, how much are we seeing sovereign citizen ideology, narratives, terminology present itself in other forms of extremism?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating part of this question too, that the mix of those ideologies into the IMVE. I think I think earlier on when that language started being used more nationally, I did feel like everything was sort of being lumped under, like that IMVE was sort of on the one hand a synonym for right-wing extremism, but at the same time we were sort of lumping anything in that basket that was anti-government or anti-authority. And so I didn't feel like the language was that helpful, or that people just sort of, when it got used a lot to describe sort of anything that wasn't ISIS terrorism. Whereas I think what we're seeing is that either the sort of mixed, unclear, unstable situation where one individual, probably with some access online, maybe some offline influence, does the sort of pick and mix thing that influences it. So I think that's one situation that we obviously still need to be aware of. I think for the most part, and then, I mean, this goes to ASIO threat assessments and other things that have been made available publicly around sort of the rates of IMVE going up during COVID to maybe 50% and then down to a third. And you know, I would let others speak for sort of the in terms of operationally, how much is that playing in? But my sense is that for the most part, law enforcement is dealing with an issue of much larger numbers of people who are using these arguments in practice. But those people not really posing any kind of terrorism threat. And then what I hope is that that's not then diluting sort of law enforcement intelligence gathering of who is a threat, because, and I think that's sort of where I see part of our research is saying, well, here's what's going on with most of these people in sort of your RBTs and house visits. But that, and yes, flag them as a sovereign citizen, but that doesn't mean it doesn't mean they are therefore by definition a national security threat or worthy of sort of more surveillance just because they have the same ideology that may feed into a sort of mix of IMVE. So that's quite a hard job, I think, to say who is more kind of at risk of progressing towards violence. And I wouldn't, you know, overclaim to be able to predict anything like that or identify factors. But if it was some things, I'd say like that we know from the field would be, you know, use of accelerationist language, use of a war narrative, more delusional beliefs, you know, and other things that we're starting to see with lone actor terrorism, perhaps more so than ISIS terrorism. So still approaching it through that lens. Whereas for me, the majority of the sovereign citizen lens is a different kind of problem.
So we have time for one or two more questions, and we've got one here where it asks about the regional diversity in sovereign citizens. So is there more connection between sovereign citizens in Queensland and the United States than, say, other areas, for example? Or perhaps maybe are you seeing overlaps between sovereign citizen manifestations in Australia and New Zealand, where we also know there's kind of a growth in sovereign citizen ideology and uptake? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, these are, again, really interesting questions that, and I spoke maybe just very briefly about it at the start, the sort of relationship across different countries. I mean, connections between individual influences and, say, a local attacker is sort of one aspect of that question. And then I suppose the other part is that I find very interesting is how the ideology differs across countries. So in New Zealand, that I'm very interested to talk to any New Zealand colleagues about this as well, around the particular way that plays out with, I've seen more sort of use of the law of the sea in New Zealand and drawing on Maori's sovereignty ideas. And then in Australia, we have our own version of it. So there's that part of the question. But I feel like there's also what you're getting at too is perhaps we are seeing, I believe, more uptake of this in sort of regional and rural areas, and a lot of concern amongst law enforcement around those regional areas compared to inner city urban areas. I think that's fair to say. We're wondering if we could sort of do more around that, around geocoding or interviews in different areas and things like that, that might be able to speak to that more. But that is certainly our sense from the initial findings, that rural, remote, regional areas, that this is a very key concern, and less so, you know, in inner city Brisbane compared to further out. Yeah.
Well, fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Keiran, for that presentation. The research project sounds absolutely fascinating. We wait to see more of what comes out of that. And also, you offered us like a really interesting and broad overview of the movement of a whole, and things that we need to consider for the future. So please, everyone, join me in thanking Professor Hardy for this webinar. We'd also, before we close, like to make you aware of our upcoming webinar, which will actually take place later this month on April 30th. You can find information on that on the AVERT website, and you can look to register. This webinar is going to be presented by Dr. Joel Busher, who's a professor of political sociology at Coventry University in the UK. And for those of us who are familiar with AVERT, you might remember that he also served as a keynote speaker for us in symposiums past. Professor Busher's webinar will be on violence, escalation, and inhibition during far-right protest waves. And he'll talk about some work that examines interactions between far-right protesters, counter-protesters, and other actors, looking at case studies in the US, UK, and Germany. So if you're interested in that, please be sure to register and sign up. Once again, thank you, Professor Hardy, and we look forward to seeing you all next time for our next AVERT webinar. Take care for now. Thank you.